So what I want you to start thinking about is how do you see the world and what happens within the world. One of the reasons this is important is because, as you will come to see over this semester and over the next few years, is occupational therapists understand the world in a slightly different way to some of the other professions, but it's actually a really important distinction that we need to start thinking about from now. So I just want to spend a bit of time thinking about that right now. Just to get you thinking a bit differently, first, this is a map of the world, pretty obvious, and people wouldn't disagree, I don't think, that that is a map of the world and is fairly accurate. Okay, but what about this one? So this is as it says up the top, an upside down map of the world. Who's to say that this map is any different from this one? The only reason this one is different is because it's been flipped. But we think this is the correct way or the right way to see the world because that's how we've grown up with seeing maps of the world, and because somebody long before us has labelled north being at the top, south being at the bottom, and east and west on either side. Okay, so we understand this to be the world because that's the way it has been presented to us. And that's what I want you to start thinking about, is we only see things the way we do because that's how they have been presented to us often. And depending on our perspective, we may and are probably likely to see things slightly differently. And that's what I want you to start thinking about, is changing your perspective or being aware of the perspectives that are influencing the way you see things. And that, just as it is for the world, the map of the world, so it is for life in general. What people do, why they do them, what you see when you walk down the street, etc. One of the things that has been really influential in occupational therapy is what's called a biomedical perspective. And a biomedical perspective is that idea that, in terms of thinking about health particularly, that health is about not being sick and not having an illness. So a biomedical view talks about illness is the underlying single cause of poor health, and that disease is always the single underlying cause, and that we can measure that through lots of tests and measurements, and that if we can cure that disease or remove that cause, then that will result in a return to health. Okay. Now that's hugely useful, and you have probably seen lots of examples in your life or other people's lives where that way of approaching health and illness makes a lot of sense. And thank goodness we have that way of thinking about things. However, if you just think a bit more about that, one argument that has been proposed is that the biomedical perspective is so pervasive that it has permeated most aspects of society to the extent that it is now the folk view of humans and health, so that it is now the default way that humans understand health and well-being. Okay? Which is a problem, but we'll come back to that. I'll just give you some examples of how that has shaped things that maybe we're not aware of. So look, there are lots of ads like this. So it leaves your hair with 100% dandruff-free, gorgeous hair. A 100% reported smooth skin, refined skin texture, 97% reported healthy glow. And that you can reduce your waist measurements by an average of 1.4 inches in 8 weeks. Okay. Now, all of those things are, in my view, part of it anyway, is influenced by that biomedical way of seeing the world. And it's because it's about the measurement, that there are things underlying that we can fix and change that will improve things. So if we get rid of the wrinkles, we can measure the wrinkles, we can measure satisfaction with the wrinkle reduction, and that our life will be so much better. There are other things at play there, of course, but the biomedical perspective is a key part of that. So, thinking about things in that way makes us see the world from that perspective. And while sometimes it's useful, it means that we may not see other issues. For example, think about if someone has a disease that cannot be fixed, in inverted commas. It could be argued from a biomedical perspective that they are destined to never be healthy. Okay? Similarly, and I'll give you an example. Think of somebody who's had a spinal cord injury, and at the current time, we can't cure spinal cord injury. But there are a lot of people with spinal cord injuries who live very full, satisfying, healthy lives despite that injury that they have sustained. Similarly, think about the effects of social or political forces that don't result in illness, but do result in negative health outcomes. And you talked about some of those the other week. For example, people who are refugees and asylum seekers, people who are homeless, marginalised, socially excluded, all of those sorts of things. In a biomedical perspective, they may not be seen as having health issues, and yet some of their health outcomes are actually very poor. Also, when you think about occupational therapists, as I've sort of hinted at, occupational therapists see the world a bit differently, which is what we'll be talking about this semester particularly. And one of our issues is we don't see the world in a biomedical way, and so sometimes there can be a clash between those two ways of seeing things. And that can be a real problem if we don't recognise what's going on. So really the importance is being able to understand what perspectives are shaping the way that we see things, so that we can be aware of that. So we need to be aware of this biomedical perspective in terms of how it shapes the way that we see things, but more importantly, we need to be aware of an occupational perspective of humans and health. That's the view that occupational therapists have, and that's the one that we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about and learning about. So what is an occupational perspective of health? Well, we're not going to answer that right now in great detail, but a few things for you to think about are, one of them is the idea that human beings are occupational beings. Okay? And that's not but just that. Occupation is it's a nice thing for humans to engage in. It's much more significant than that. It's the idea that human beings are intrinsically occupational. Okay? It's what defines us as humans. Something else which is important in terms of thinking about what the occupational perspective is the idea that humans have a need for and a capacity to engage in and orchestrate daily occupations in the environment over the lifespan. So it's not just that these occupations happen, we have a need for them, but also we have the ability to do them, and we also have the ability, but we also need to, orchestrate and manage how we complete all the occupations we need, want, or have to do. Again, we've touched on these next 2 points in the last few sessions, but the idea that all occupations happen within a range of environments, and one of those is over the lifespan. And so you can see just from those 2 points, there's no mention of illness, disease, or disability. And that's because we're concerned much more about what people do, why they do it, how they manage doing it, etc. So what I want you to really start thinking about is this occupational perspective of health. I've given you a few examples so far in terms of a biomedical view, which is different, but is hugely influential and useful, but also just started to touch on an occupational perspective. And the book chapter that you've got to read for this week will take that another step further, and then we'll follow that up in class. So that's the end of this short video. Read the rest of the blog post, do the activities, do the reading, and I'll see you in class. Bye for now.